Can we start? I think we can start. If people can take a seat, maybe. There's a microphone. Yeah. Nice. Yes, yes, yes. Anyway, I'll do it with this one. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Giovanni Salvetti. I'm going to moderate this panel today. And, you know, that's the one in the picture, even if, you know, that was probably a few years ago. And it looks like the portrait of Dorian Gray, I'm afraid. And my name is actually not exactly like this. It's Giovanni with 2 N and G, but whatever, doesn't matter. Anyway, I'm very pleased to be here today, and we are going to talk about, you know, the panel is about state asset sale and capital development in emerging markets. And frankly speaking, I believe that there are very few regions which can illustrate this topic better than Central Asia. And I would say actually Uzbekistan, by far, is probably the most representative, having delivered 2 landmark transaction in the last few weeks. Few days ago, we were with Mr. Murodov of Uzama at the signing of a very significant transaction, which was a privatization of Mobius, 100% of Mobius, for a price which was exceeding $350 million and capital commitments of in excess of 500 million. So a transaction which would bring some close to $1 billion to Uzbekistan. And just a few weeks ago, the state, and it was announced very publicly and very visibly, did the privatization through IPO of Uznif, a landmark transaction, over $600 million of shares, value of shares issued on the London Stock Exchange, the first IPO on an international exchange, and I believe the first with a dual listing, which is extremely relevant. So in a couple of, a month and a half, 2 very significant transactions have taken place. They are at the opposite end of the privatization spectrum. One is a private deal, another one is an IPO. But they very nicely represent how active is Uzbekistan in privatization and how strong is the interest of foreign investments. I can't think, seriously, I'm covering CIS, but I look at different emerging markets. I can't think of any other geography which have been so active and so successful like Uzbekistan in attracting foreign investment so far. And I have a privilege of, you have a privilege of listening to some of the people which have contributed and even led this transaction, which are here today. And the way we are going to run this panel is by asking questions to them. But then at the end, you will have also the opportunity to ask your own question to make it more interactive. I think it's always interesting. And I hope you will find it interesting. But let me first introduce this fantastic panel. Mr. Murodov, I start from Mr. Murodov because I represent the state. Is not here, but his deputy, Alisher Miraliev of Uzama, the company which signed the Mobius deal, is here today. And Uzama is one of the most relevant state holding company active in privatization. They sold in the last 5 years, I counted over $5 billion of assets, very significant number for emerging markets. So I'm very pleased to give Alisher a welcome. We have also here my long-standing friend, Kodir Norov. I've been knowing him for 15 years, and I'm very glad that recently he managed to close the first ever private equity fully focused on Uzbekistan. I think it's a very important step for the country to have this type of players. And besides that, he was also involved in Uznif, especially on the dual listing. Xavier Herstel, very important investor because Aéroport de Paris is golden standard for international investors. So his perspective, I mean, they operate an airport where I believe each one of you passed at least a few times in his life, Paris and Orly, and I think it's the biggest in Europe. And they are very, very diligent investors, and I think his perspective is going to be very relevant for emerging markets. Then you have Eugene Gassiev. Morgan Stanley doesn't need an introduction. It's one of the largest banks in the world. They didn't participate to SNIF, but they also doing okay. They did also recently some discrete deal. SpaceX was also kind of not bad. So maybe you can say something on how global markets are looking at Uzbekistan. And last but not least, Tomer Pinkushevich of Gibson Dunn. No. Actually, I forgot David. Sorry. David Gottlieb. I have been knowing him for many years, and of course is working at Cleary Gottlieb, and he's a young veteran of these markets, and he had a very significant impact on UZNIF, because I think one of the biggest challenge was the legislation, getting this deal ready for compliant and aligning the legislation. He's going to talk about this, but he has done many deals in the region. And I was mentioning Tomer Pinkushevich, who is an American lawyer specialized in emerging markets, especially in infrastructure. And I think, I mean, I've been here for a few years. I've never seen so many Americans like this year. So I think the perspective of U.S. investor and advisor to U.S. investor is very, very relevant. Maybe if you want to applaud them to give them a little bit of encouragement, that would be nice. Thank you for that. Maybe we start with Alisher, if that's okay. I'm not sure if it's going to be in English or translated. So if you have a device for translation, if you're not fluent in Uzbek, maybe it's worthwhile. Actually, I'm not fluent either. I don't sure I have the apparatus, but let's see. Well, you can speak in Russian. I don't know how many you speak in Russian. I'm okay, but I don't know the others. Sorry, a bit of improvisation. Italian should be good with that, but not sure. Anyway, maybe I don't. Okay. Let's see if it works. Maybe we start with. So, Alisher, first of all, are you happy of the outcome of Mobius? Mobius, because UZNIF was oversubscribed 5 times. Are you happy with the outcome of Mobius? And was it, I mean, the process there is less public than UZNIF. Were there a lot of interest as well on Mobius?
Добрый день.
Good day, dear participants of our meeting. Thank you so much, Giovanni. In terms of the Mobius transaction, I can say that this was one of the biggest transactions in the history of Uzbekistan privatization, and we did not expect that we will have such a deal after Coca-Cola. The biggest one was Coca-Cola when we had this transaction, 252 million. It was a real investment, but still in these 3 years, 150 million investors brought as the foreign direct investment to build plants. So we were expecting huge results out of the Mobius deal, and we should be frank, saying that privatization of big assets, this is something new to us. Only in the last 4 or 5 years, when we are the attraction of the consultants, we launched the process in 2024 at the regulatory level. Actually, we expanded the methods for privatization. For example, we used only 2 methods, exchange or auction, and now we have up to 8 methods based on the international experience. And if we look at the dynamics, we can see that every year the president set a task to attract investors, and also we understand what should be there, what the investors require, what conditions should be created for the better investment climate. And judging by the dynamics, we can say that the conditions were created and they are quite attractive. So Uzbekistani market is attractive. And of course, to attract investment, the main method would be privatization. Annually, we, as people say, we set ambitious plans, but the numbers speak for themselves. The big assets, large assets, those which a couple of years ago, for example, Mobius, these assets, they were perceived as the strategically important assets, and the task was to keep such assets with the state, given that, let's say, they are of strategic importance for the economy of the country. But the reforms in all of the sectors of economy, transferring the assets to the private sector, involvement of the private sector via the privatization and PPP, demonstrated the best results. In the energy sector, of course, we also have a lot of private sector participation. We have used a lot of governmental assets for that to transfer to the private sector. Uz Auto Motors is the only exception, but after the realization of the assets, the diversification of the manufacturing started. Even last year, Sam Auto, a plant in Samarkand, which manufactured buses. And the last point which was mentioned, Uzniv, yes, this is quite a significant result for Uzbekistan, because in order to enter the international market, our enterprises, organizers, and the assets which are disposed of, I think this was a very good benchmarking, an example, and this shows the trust of the investors in terms of the reforms implemented in Uzbekistan. The next asset, in my opinion, and just recently we met with our colleagues, with Tomer as well, and you rightly mentioned that in the recent years, the geography of investors expanded significantly as well. And you have also pointed out that we have more and more of American investors coming into the country. They are quite active in terms of bidding and sales. And this year, I think that we are already actually preparing for a new program of privatization, and very soon, after the approval by the president, I suppose we will be able to offer a more extended list of the big assets for investors, for example, from the energy sector, power stations, infrastructural enterprises, and automobile industry, roads, financial sectors. We have insurance companies, banks would also join. So even the banks would be a subject to the asset disposition. And we will start an active work on the privatization. And I guess that after the investment forum, our expectations would be new partners, new investors to come into the country, the line investors, because our target is not only to get one-time profit from the asset sales. We have some strategic goals to attract real potential investors working in a specific sector, which in future, via the attraction of the direct investment and modernization, the current capacity of the enterprises being sold would expand the manufacturing processes, that they will bring new products. There is a social goal here as well for the government. I mean, to employ local population, new jobs creation, and at the same time, the new standards of management for the companies would also be introduced. There will be new export markets to sell the products produced at these enterprises. I can also mention that we strongly believe that some auto, for example, has an investor which has a plan to create on the basis of some auto a hub exporting the products to the neighboring countries, CAEx countries. And I think that other big enterprises in Uzbekistan, which are subject to asset sales or asset disposition, would pursue the same goal, not only just to get the profit one time, no, but to have the long-term impact for the modernization and development of these companies. Thank you.
Continue with another couple of questions. Uznif was IPO. Mobius is a private deal. There are many other assets which the government, the state wants to privatize. Can you elaborate a bit more on the logic? Who is deciding and how they are deciding which company goes for a privatization and which company goes for private transaction? Who and what's the logic which is being pursued to decide which option is pursued?
Ну, желание у нас
So we have several presidential resolutions, the privatization program, and actually we have a law on privatization which was adopted in 2024, the new law. The old one was adopted in 1991. That is why we had to update it. In accordance with the new law, the privatization programs are approved by the president, by the president's decision. We have a number of president decisions which define the methods for the disposition of the big assets, big enterprises. So they are placed on the international tenders through the involvement of the consultants. And also there are enterprises, the shares of which belong to the governmental package. And this part is actually placed for the IPO. So if one of the methods of disposition is the IPO, but there are certain assets where the government has its shares. So those enterprises, for example, Mobius or some auto, Coca-Cola, and other enterprises, they were disposed of in accordance with the privatization program. So they were sold or realized fully with the governmental share, so for 100%. With regards to the Uznif, in that case, we had the IPO placement, and part of the shares was placed, as it was previously mentioned, to the listing at the international market and local. So this was dual listing, as you have mentioned. But we also understand clearly that Uznif is a big company which combines. Actually, it was established through the transfer of the shares of the high liquidity shares from other governmental organizations or institutions. That is why in this case we decided to have the asset dispositions partially through IPO.
Понятно. Спасибо. which came to my mind now. I mean, talking about the various program of privatization, I've been working in this market for like many years now, like over 10 years. I remember at the beginning, it was mostly, there were Russian, quite a lot of Russian interest, European, primarily Germany and France, bit of Korean, South Korean, obviously. Now I see a lot of American coming in. Big surprise, I mean, positive surprise, but just I think it's quite recent, especially on minerals. I see more Indians, more Chinese as well. Where do you expect the biggest interest for the future? From which geographies? And of course, Middle East. Middle East is really came up very, very strong in the last 4 or 5 years, I believe, very dynamically. So there are new players, new geography, which are getting interested in Uzbekistan. And where do you think this trend is going? And where do you think, where is your expectation in terms of identity of region of interest in Uzbekistan going forward?
Ну, вы правы сейчас.
Yes, you're right. We previously have not many partners from US, and I think it really depends on the kind of assets, the nature of the assets we dispose, if they are of higher liquidity or not. Previously, the geography of investors was mostly the CIS countries, few European countries, but now we have a larger cooperation with European countries. Almost all of them are present here. We have also investors from China, a huge flow of investors from China. As a part of investment forum, we reached some agreements, having this joint ventures with the Chinese partners, and today we had a number of discussions on processing metals and taking into account the reforms, especially gun metal. And the Chinese investors, French investors, and on uranium, we have a lot of French investors in the country. And the geography. But I cannot restrict my answer with these countries only. But on daily basis, we have meetings with various investors, and we do our best to give valuable propositions, and our assets are of interest for them. And in the nearest future, if we have new privatization programs, we will announce international tenders on assets. And you yourself, with the example of Mobius, can verify that many other investors competed the bidding for Mobius from different continents, but we are ready to discuss the terms with investors and will provide all opportunities for them. We have a lot of incentives in privatization. We dispose not only assets but land plots as well. We have 10 millions for foreign direct investments, and we have not less than 35% for the instant payments, and the asset can be given as a collateral or as a security. Previously, we had very strict requirements for privatization, but now the mechanism is quite flexible. and it's all reflected in presidential decree, in privatization program number 70. You can see the number of incentives and advantages given to investors, which makes conditions quite favorable for them. They can pay instantly or and get a discount as much as 14% or have payments by installments. Those who possess enough money, they can pay 100% at once and get that discount, or other investors can, as I said, pay by installments. But we are flexible, we are eager to cooperate based on what they want and have this mutually beneficial agreements. Thank you once again, Mr. Alisher, for your frank answer.
Now, we heard a very broad and very comprehensive review of opportunities and of the trends from the state. I think it's very valuable. Let's move maybe to the investor perspective, and I'll start with Kodri, if it's okay. First, private equity established here. Private equity normally are very relevant facilitators of transformation, deals, growth. Tell us a little bit more about your fund and where are you going to focus your investments? Privatizations or private state companies, private companies, and model of investment and prerequisite for investments? That would be interesting.
Let me just and then I'll give it to you back. Thank you, Giovanni. First of all, good to see many good friends here, capital market participants in this room. Giovanni, you're right. I mean, since we first met each other about 15 years ago, there has been a lot of change. First of all, finally, we have free convertibility of currency. You know, for a minute, if we just remember 10 years ago, Uzbek Sum was not even convertible. And now we're sitting here discussing the oversubscribed IPO of a first Uzbek company on London Stock Exchange. And for a minute, I want to remind that it was the first IPO on London Stock Exchange this year, and it was the Uzbek company. So I think we need to internalize how important this juncture is at which we are witnessing, at which we are present. There have been a lot of people involved in the successful IPO of Uznif. And a lot of times behind the numbers, you know, 700 million was raised. It was 4 times oversubscribed. Super high quality investors participated in the IPO. BlackRock, Franklin Templeton itself bought it. The fact that Redwill was there as well. The fact that the fund is managed by Franklin Templeton, and this is more than $1.3 trillion fund, is also a big deal, and it gave a lot of confidence and trust for investors. But what's a lot of times overlooked, and this is coming back to your question, Giovanni, is that the second aspect, the second segment of the placement was actually on Tashkent Stock Exchange. And this is an important mandate of Franklin Templeton. I know Marius talks a lot about that as well. Marius then from Franklin Templeton, is that I mean, he tells me that one of the reasons our president supported that project is because Franklin Templeton, at the beginning, when they were pitching, they were saying it's not just the idea to raise money and fill up states' coffers. You know, the budget was 700 million, which is still very good, but it's also to bring in foreign institutional investors to local capital markets. Because we need that. You know, I'll give you just to put things in perspective. When we talk about local capital markets, what are we talking about? So we have a Tashkent Stock Exchange. It's been around since independence. It's in Central Asia, with one of the few countries that had stock exchange from the very beginning. But just if we look just 5 years ago, the number of trades on Tashkent Stock Exchange were around 300 trades per day. Okay, so this is not to shame anything, but this is just to tell you how the cup, you know, it's half full. And last year we had 1,500 trades, so this is 5 times. And guess how many trades we have already this year? Well, I'm not going to be asking you, but around 5,000 trades already. So this is more than 3 times than the numbers last year. And in terms of volumes, if we had about $150 million in, as equivalent, the trades are done in local currency in Zoom, but $150 million in 2021. Just last year, we had about 800 million in equivalent for the whole year. And these first 4 months, we have about 400 million. So you can see the dynamics. This is huge progress. And again, if you put it on the perspective on international exchanges, these are still tiny numbers. And I'll give you even another statistics just for the collection. There are about 120 listed companies on Tashkent Stock Exchange. And in total, around 50,000 accounts were opened before the UZNIF. Out of them, about 15,000 were active. 15, yeah? And just for the UZNIF, there were more than 7,000 new accounts opened. But for a country with population of 38 million, we can see how huge is the potential. So what does it bring us now to today's conversation? Is that the capital markets are crucial as a place to direct investments into capital of local companies. Because we cannot just be going and doing IPO on international stock exchange. We have to develop the local capital markets because we need to get the participation of the local population in the capital markets. But with UZNIF, what we saw is that a huge number of investors which were not present in capital markets all of a sudden showed interest. I'm sure that here I see some of the investors who also participated in UZNIF IPO on local stock exchange. And just within the first couple of weeks, we saw an increase in the price of shares about 25–30%. And before, people were looking at bank deposits, and they were making 20% in local currency, with local currency appreciating. So that's better than even some of the hedge funds, and it's the tax-free with almost full liquidity. But now when we have blue chips like this, like UZNIF, people are starting to understand that the shares, the equity market is not just a source where you can get dividends, so you can compare it to deposits. It's actually a place where you can actually create wealth through the increase in the nominal value. Again, for many of the foreign investors sitting here, this is no-brainer. But for the market as young as Uzbekistan's, this was a huge shift. So the more we see, since the panel is about not just capital markets but also privatization, the more companies will be privatized. And there are 13 companies in the pipeline, in the portfolio of UZNIF. Some of them were already announced. The president announced that Uzbekistan Airways is coming up for IPO probably early next year, end of this year. And so the more quality companies come to the market, there will be more and more interest, and the local capital markets will become more and more significant as a source of attracting capital for local entrepreneurs. Because what's happening now, if we talk about the private sector, so I'll just mention 2 words about our fund. Highland Capital is a new player in Uzbekistan. We just completed our first close with IFC, EBRD, and the Silk Road Fund of China. For the fund, we raised $36 million US. As Giovanni said, this is the first institutional private equity fund in Uzbekistan, because there were private equity funds, but this were with the government. So we have Adui, we have Uzoman, we have Uzbekistan Azerbaijan Investment Company. We are the first ones fully privately managed and who will be focusing purely on SMEs. So the size of our investments will be 3 to 5 million and will be going just into equity. And the idea is to support the consumer sector, private companies in pharmaceuticals, in retail, FMCG, healthcare sector, those companies that are overlooked by these big funds that I just mentioned, and they were just limited to banks, so they could just get loans. Equity was not available, and so this is the mission with which we created Highland Capital. But Highland Capital itself, this is a fund too. The first fund was created in Kyrgyzstan by my 2 partners, Eldan and Cholpombek, back in 2018. So this is a second fund. And why we are interested in developed capital markets. So my company, Avest Investment Group, which I founded earlier in 2003, was one of the underwriters of UZNIF IPO. And we were glad to participate in this historical event, and we saw that there is a demand. The people are willing to take money outside, under the mattress and put it into the capital markets. But the idea is that the more interesting companies, not just state companies, but private companies, will be listed on stock exchange, the more we'll see participation.
Just wanted to understand a little bit better. I'm interested in the dual list. There's a lot of talk about dual listing, but in reality, there are not too many happening in emerging markets. I'd like to understand of a local listing, how much were local investors and how much were foreign investors investing in the local market?
Yeah, thank you, Giovanni. That's a good question, actually. So around more than 20 million was placed in the local exchange. The total was 700, so mostly it was on London Stock Exchange. Obviously, for the reasons that I mentioned, liquidity of London Stock Exchange is much bigger than the local exchange. But surprisingly, we saw a lot of interest from international investors who were buying locally, because the London tranche was oversubscribed 4 times. And Uzbekistan tranche was oversubscribed 50%. So you had much bigger chance to get better allocation on the local exchange than internationally. So a lot of players, especially frontier market hedge funds, private individuals, family offices, they came in and opened accounts locally because they could get a better allocation. But this also shows trust in the local infrastructure. Things actually work. You can get your dividends. If you sell shares on the stock exchange, you can get them converted and get back to your foreign bank account. The transactions are reasonable. They're becoming more and more reasonable every day. The infrastructure costs are decreasing. So this was also a sign that international investors are happy to transact locally, but we just need more quality companies listed on stock exchange.
Excellent, thank you very much. Let's move to another investor, Xavier, Aéroport de Paris, as I mentioned earlier. I don't think you have assets now in Uzbekistan, but you have a lot of assets, and you're looking at different markets in emerging and even frontier markets. And you operate in a regulated infrastructure business, so regulation is very relevant. Can you tell us more, when you look at emerging market, what are the prerequisites for you to invest eventually in emerging markets? What is really critical for you, and something you cannot live without, considering an investment?
It's okay. Thank you, Giovanni. You're right. We are not present in Uzbekistan at this time. But for Group Aéroport de Paris, we manage right now 25 airports outside of France, in addition with the 3 Paris airports. And we have many airports in emerging countries. Why? Since airline traffic is growing worldwide, whatever be the crisis, sanitary crisis like COVID, whatever be geopolitical challenges, like we are facing right now in the Gulf region, the airline traffic is growing worldwide, especially in emerging countries. But airline traffic needs 2 things that are very important. First of all, investments in capacity and infrastructure. And second of all, managing this traffic, because what an airport operator can help for a country, can add value, it's to improve traffic, especially to improve the connectivity, to open new lines, to open new destinations, to attract new companies. And that's the added value we try to have in all the countries in which we are present. And as you said, the difference between traditional privatization, and Uzbekistan launched a very ambitious program that we have really to push. But it's a traditional program for companies which can be run by the private sector. For the infrastructure sector, you have a specific challenge to face, which is sovereignty. That's why it's difficult for a government in an emerging country, but in a traditional European country as well, to give to the private sector for an indefinite period such important assets like energy, airports, transports, or defense companies, for example. And that's why the best way to get the best advantages of privatizations, it's concessions or PPPs. Because in a PPP, there is a strong guarantee for a government of an emerging country. It's to get the asset back after a 25 or 30 years period, which is very important. That's why in this sort of negotiation, PPPs, concessions, you have to balance the risks and the opportunities between the grantor, traditionally government, and the operator. But this system of PPP is the best one to give to an emerging country investments, money for investments, improving the quality for transport or airport industry, which is the one that I know the best, but for the government to keep its sovereignty with a very precise contract for concession and to be sure to get the asset back after 20, 25 or 30 years. That's why a balanced negotiation is very important, much more than the figures, much more than the amount of money, the amount of investment. The balanced contract is the most important for negotiating a PPP with an emerging country. But I really think that it's a huge opportunity for emerging countries because they are sure that with a PPP, with a private investor, they will get the speed in investment, the quality of investment, and the connectivity with the added value that we can have. That's the model we have worldwide. And I think really perhaps 80 or 90% of PPPs or airport privatizations worldwide since 20 years, most of them has been operated by huge European airport companies coming from France, our colleagues in Germany, Spain, Italy, Switzerland. And because we know exactly what added value we can have, but we have to respect the sovereignty of a country because a capital airport, we know that it's a very sensitive asset. We know that in Paris, and we know that in other countries. We have, as we say, to be Turkish in Turkey, we have to be Kazakh in Kazakhstan, we have to be Jordan in Jordania, as we are currently.
Very good, very good. Thank you. You have clearly the very unique perspective of owner of assets in a very regulated and very efficient market like France, with a very high valuation and regulation which is super strong and tested for many years. But maybe the growth, growth is high, but not clearly high as in emerging markets. And you also have a perspective of emerging markets where normally the growth is significantly higher. Maybe regulation is not as good as in the West because it's in transformation and because many legislation need to be perfectioned in order to reach Western standards. Typically, I'm not talking about any country in particular. Are you thinking about emerging market with? Are you more relaxed on the standard of regulation you expect versus mature market or consolidating market like France? Is there a trade-off that you consider, or against a very strong growth, or you always require very top-notch, reliable regulation in order for you to invest?
No, that's sure that you have to balance risk and opportunity, risk and revenue. But for us, the risk we may have to challenge in emerging markets do not come from regulation, because we think that regulation is quite useful, and we think that every country in the world but insist on decarbonization, but have to insist on security, have to insist of the fact that an airport, it's not a standalone asset. An airport has to collaborate with all the neighborhood to be benefit to all the neighborhood of the airports. I think that it's common values worldwide. The only regulation we hope to lighten, it's the air traffic rights. Well, that shows that we would prefer that a country opens its sky to new companies, to new airlines, in order to improve the traffic and the value for the capital city or for the country. Voilà. But we need guarantees as well in the concession contract in emerging countries, since the risks we have to face are risks that we do not face in Europe, for example. It's a currency risk. It's perhaps a challenge to find lenders, and we thank the IFIs, EBRD, IFC for that. The risk of we may have political instability, and we manage to manage the airport if in Madagascar, in Ravinala, with 2 political coups we have to face. And I can tell you that whatever be the political regime of a country, the airport must continue to work. And we ensure that the airport continue to work, whatever be political challenges we have to face. We have the risk as well of tourism. We have the geopolitical risks. So we must be covered by the traditional MAC clause, but we want to ensure as well the stability in the concession contract. The stability is that a government, we do not like that the government invent a new tax, or we do not want that the government that subsidize the airport decided to stop this subsidy, because the initial balance of the concession must be respected. We invest a lot, we improve the quality, we will lose the asset perhaps after 25 years, so we need stability. And this stability in a traditional European country, in the US, in Latin America, in Central Asia, in emerging countries, it's the same thing. So we have to keep guarantees in the contract in order not to change the balance of the concession. But for the traditional regulation, really, I think that environmental regulation is very important for the future of the planet. We think that an airport must to be useful to population. It's very important as well to for example, to improve the skills of students, because we hire students in the airport. That's very important. The only regulation we'd like to modify, it's open skies, because really we think the best for the traffic.
Thank you, thank you. I don't want to drag you in a comparison of stability of the Uzbek political situation versus France, but other than that, this was a joke, kind of a joke. Huh?
Coming from an Italian speaker, I'm very happy for that. And congrats for the traditional stability of Italy, especially right now.
Right now, it's not so bad, actually, comparing. But anyway, everything is changing. We'll see. No, but the one or two things that, in your view, and clearly you are here because you're interested in Uzbekistan, I presume, and there are many very valuable airports which sometimes are being considered for concession privatization. What are the things that you would advise to the government that they absolutely should not do for making investors like you remaining interested in this market? What are the things that they should be avoided?
For us all, or for me?
For you, you.
Well, first of all, I think the word is trust. Really, to invest in infrastructure, it's a long-term investment. So really, the government have to trust us, and we have to trust the government. So this trust, it's a common political view of the global positive impact of an infrastructure for a country. If we have this common political strategy, I think we can negotiate a balanced contract. But really, we have to to agree on the same strategy to have balanced risks. And if at the end of the day, the risks are balanced and we have a common strategy to develop the infrastructure at the benefit of the country, I think you can have a very good negotiation and a positive impact for our country.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Let's now we've got the perception of investors. Let's talk a little bit about with the advisors and who has participated or not participated, but the technician of this transaction of privatization. Eugene, you represent a very important investment bank very active in emerging market. UZNIF clearly is a landmark transaction for Uzbekistan, but it is one. What needs to be true to make sure that it could be repeated, that this tremendous success is not a one-off and is just the beginning of a successful series of privatization done in this way, as with your expertise of advisor and book runner on emerging market IPOs.
Thank you, Giovanni. I think this is a really good question. I would start by saying that the pool of capital markets investing in the emerging markets and the frontier markets is very, very deep. So to me, it's really not a question whether the market can absorb equity flow from Uzbekistan, but rather what Uzbekistan should do to make sure there is a consistent deal flow interested for international investors. And one of the key points in my mind is a sufficient free float. And why free float is matter? There are two reasons. Reason number one, we want to make sure that Uzbekistan is included into the international indices. Just to give you a flavor of numbers, the funds which follow MSCI emerging markets indices have size of over 2 trillion. And Uzbekistan would want to capture at least 1 or 2% of that, and that would mean somewhere between 20 to 40 billion of passive money inflow into the Uzbek equities. And in order to do that, Uzbekistan's companies will need to have a sufficient free float in the market. Now, there are some other technical aspects how the company is included into the indices, but the most important is a free float. That doesn't need to be done in a day one at the time of the IPO, but there should be a strategy in place for Uzbek companies which think about the IPOs, what is their target free float in 2, 3, 4, 5 years after the IPO, and how they manage to be included into the indices. Now, and the second aspect why liquidity is important why free float is important is liquidity. The companies want to make sure that the active money managers, they can not only buy the stock, but can also subsequently trade that. We do see a lot of example from other emerging markets where the people bought equities at the IPO and they effectively stuck in that. In order to solve that, again, the companies should think about the target free float in advance. Second aspect to me is a consistent deal flow of high quality companies which are going to the IPO, and those IPOs should be well prepared. Then that includes a carefully crafted equity story, the dividend policy, the corporate governance. If those ingredients are in place, no doubt we should see many successful IPOs from the country. Investors made very decent returns. I think a lot of people were surprised how well the stock traded after the IPO. It's a huge success, not only for UZNIF, but also for Uzbekistan. And the more successful stories we'll see in the future, the more Uzbekistan will become a must-own sort of territory in the country for international investors in the future. Now, the third important aspect, and I think Kadirjon covered it really well, is making sure there is a local demand in Uzbekistan at Tashkent exchange. And that includes like a system of pension funds, of active asset managers, obviously of retail investors. No doubt the GDRs and the international demand will be super important in the next few years. But with the time, we want to see more and more local demand from investors from Uzbekistan. And also in the long run...
why is important local demand?
Well, because first, local demand for sure drives more liquidity. The significant chunk of local demand is retail investing. Two, for companies, important to have the sort of fan club of local investors, and in some instances we see that local demand, the strong local demand, can actually drive the premium valuation. Again, that happens with the time. It's not going to happen from day one in Uzbekistan, but in the next 5-10 years, I can see that the local demand can play a substantial part in the demand for the IPOs. Also, eventually, what you may want to get to is creating a mechanism where international investors can participate in the deals not only through the GDRs, but buying stocks directly at the Tashkent Stock Exchange. What we've seen in some of the other emerging markets that also initially started from GDRs listing, but subsequently, when there were the right sort of legislation and infrastructure was put in place, that the local markets have eventually had the higher liquidity than the London GDRs listings, and sort of local market became the sort of the key place for trading of shares of companies. And the last, but not the least, is keeping up with economic reforms and economic growth. People, I mean, investors into kind of global investors, they love emerging markets, which grows very quickly, or at least above the average growth globally, and they love the growth companies in those markets. And this is how those big companies can achieve the premium valuation as compared not only to other emerging markets, but some of the developed world.
That's very interesting. I was interested in what you said, that the market doesn't have a cap in terms of how much Uzbek paper is ready to digest. Is it really the case? Because, you know, when we were looking at different IPOs here, I heard consideration of say, well, international markets can absorb, 5 billion, 3 billion, this type of numbers of each year of Uzbek listing of a paper, primary, secondary, whatever. You think there is not such a limit? It's more like an emerging market capacity of funds investing in emerging market. There is no maximum allocation to Uzbekistan from international investors, right?
Yeah, 100%, Giovanni. In our mind, and we do a lot of transaction across other emerging markets, the pool of money which follow these markets is very, very deep. And also, if you look at what's happening in some of the developed countries, particularly in the US, I think eventually the cycle will turn from the AI stories, and people will want to buy the real businesses across mining, retail, banking in some of the growth markets. So to me, there is no doubt that the pool of capital for Uzbekistan, I wouldn't say unlimited, but is very deep.
Very good. Just one last question, and then we move on. But you do equity and debt capital markets. Where do you see your activity going forward in Uzbekistan and Central Asia? Do you expect more activity for your bank, for yourself, in equity capital markets or in debt capital markets?
Morgan Stanley is very early days in Uzbekistan. We've already done one transaction last year. I think going forward, Giovanni, you're right that equity capital markets and the debt capital markets is going to be our primary focus, both for government companies, but also we see a lot of interesting companies on the private side.
Thank you, Eugene. Okay, now if I may, David, you didn't say too much because I didn't ask you anything, which is normal. But you have a lot of things to say because I know that if there is one of the person who made it happen, it's you and your team, because I know about the enormous effort of adjusting the legislation to make this happen. I think it would be very interesting to understand what you did, what was the critical challenges, and first of all, congratulations for the success once again.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here in Tashkent again for the second year. Last year, I introduced myself in Russian. This year, I was going to introduce myself in Uzbek, but I discovered to my chagrin that Google Translate doesn't have a function that speaks Uzbek, so you can read the letters, but it doesn't tell you how to pronounce it, so I decided to dispense with the Uzbek. I come at this from a very practical angle. Obviously, I'm a US-trained capital markets lawyer. I've been practicing in London for about 16 years, and I've been around the emerging markets for almost 25 years, including during what I would describe as the market development phase of many countries. And I think what we're seeing here is a very different approach. First of all, it's happening much quicker than we've seen it in some other emerging markets. And there's a real commitment from the government to make it happen, not in a way to make public announcements to say, we've got a reform agenda and we've got this list of privatizations, but actually in a way to make it executable and with an approach that is constructive, that allows advisors to advise on what is necessary to get a transaction done in a way that I think, at least I haven't seen in other emerging markets. So I think the government deserves a lot of credit for making happen what has happened in a very short period of time. When I look at state asset sales, I don't see them simply as privatizations. I see them actually as an institutional building exercise. So what makes a successful transaction is a bunch of things coming together at once. I think it's the law, it's the regulatory environment or the regulatory regime, it's the exchange, it's the custody chain, it's the disclosure framework, it's the government's willingness to engage with investors so that they can sell the assets, and it's building the market's confidence in the reform story of the market. And this is why I think Uzbekistan is such an important case study. As I say, the country hasn't just announced reform, it's made it executable in a way that allowed us to do UZNIF in just under 9 months, which is incredible for the first privatization. So it's a landmark in very many ways. I'm not going to go through again all the firsts, but there are many firsts in this transaction. But I think the significance goes beyond just those labels. The transaction showed that you can take in Uzbekistan a portfolio of state-owned assets. You can put it into a structure that's professionally managed by Franklin Templeton. You can subject it to international disclosure standards, governance expectations, and you can attract serious global institutional capital as well as local demand. And you can end up with a good aftermarket performance. So we priced this as a fixed price offering. We were the precursor, by the way, to SpaceX, which did the same thing, copying us. And it opened above the issue price. It traded at a significant premium on the first day. I was at the London Stock Exchange and I got to see the green arrow going up and up and up as soon as the market opened. And it's still well above the issue price. I looked before I came here today. It was at, we priced at 25, is it with $30.60. So still more than 20% above the issue price. But to get to your question, Giovanni, on the key structural features that made this happen, obviously it's very important to have a legal and authorizing framework to make a privatization work. And in this country, I think the government came at it with a very innovative approach. There wasn't a privatization law, a fully developed privatization law in place. So what the government did, we worked closely with the presidential administration, who was very enthusiastic and very collaborative, willing to listen to suggestions from us and the other advisors on the deal, helping them draft presidential decrees that enabled the IPO. The engagement was not cosmetic, and it's one of the reasons the transaction happened, and it happened on the timetable they said it was going to happen on. So what they used was what they call a regulatory sandbox. And what that means is, and Uzbekistan has employed this model, by the way, in other sectors, including the banking sector, fintech, capital markets, and you test the framework in a controlled environment. The idea is simple, where you don't have the primary legislation and it's not fully adapted to the needs of an international transaction. The government and the regulator can test the framework through secondary legislation or the special legal regime created for the transaction, which is in effect what we got. And if then that works in practice, you can roll it out into primary legislation and adopt a primary law that is modeled on the sandbox framework. As I said, we played an active role in establishing this framework. It was based on 3 presidential decrees. The first one, which was adopted in December 2025, established the key pillars for a GDR program in Uzbekistan. We worked closely together with the GDR depository to make this happen. The presidential decree clarified the legal status of a depository bank and a local custodian, which you need for the infrastructure. It allowed the depository bank to exercise shareholder rights on behalf of GDR holders on a proportionate basis. So it recognized that the GDR was a nominee holder and not actually the legal and beneficial owner of the shares. And it permitted free of payment transfers without a change in beneficial ownership. This allows conversion between the GDRs and the underlying shares, which ultimately creates additional liquidity because you have seamless fungibility in both markets. But that wasn't all. We needed a second presidential decree, and in April of 2026, we had a second decree which set out provisions aimed specifically at facilitating the UZNEF IPO, including interim procedures for allowing the dual listing, and various provisions regarding the status of IPO participants, the issuer, the banks, the selling shareholder. We understand that this framework is expected to be incorporated into a new capital markets law, although that's working its way through the parliament now. We don't know the exact timing of when that will be adopted. And it's worth noting that this legal framework that we got for the transaction was really only for a secondary offering. So that's an offering of existing shares. The government was selling its stake in UZNEF, or a stake in UZNEF, rather than a primary offering, which is the issuer issuing its own new shares. So that's the next step in the process, because if we want to facilitate capital raising by state-owned enterprises and private enterprises, we will need to have a law that permits a primary offering as well. And the final piece of this was, and I think that the bankers will acknowledge the importance of this, was to create a legal framework for the green shoe structure. That is a stabilization mechanism used in an IPO so that you can over-allot and make sure that the banks can trade and stabilize the price of the security in the immediate days following the offering. In most privatizations, I'm familiar with, you can't use a green shoe structure, which means that the selling shareholder will give the banks an option to purchase additional shares to cover the over allotments that they did on day one. And that's because the privatization legislation generally sets a limit on what the government can sell. And so if the limit is 30%, you can't grant an option beyond that to allow for stabilization. Now, we have ways of working around that. We use a so-called brown shoe, which is a put option instead of a call option, but it's not the natural way these things are done. And I think the Uzbek government understood the importance of this, and that it would facilitate the aftermarket, which it obviously has. And so we spent a fair amount of time creating a framework for a green shoe option in this transaction. So I think those are the main sort of legal aspects of the transaction that were novel, that were being developed in real time as we did the transaction, and that will hopefully serve as the framework for a new capital markets law, which will allow us to continue to do IPOs both state-owned and in the private sector.
Thank you very much. I mean, these are a lot of technical things you say that maybe it's not very for everyone to understand, but as I know a little bit these things, I really commend for the enormous effort that you did, and I think this is going to be very helpful for future. Now, that's my question. Considering what the legislation requires, you mentioned that capital market law is being prepared. How much, in percentage of what you did, you and your colleagues did, how much has been done, and how much still to be done in order to have a legal framework which would enable continuation of IPOs in a way which is state of the art, but very much standards of emerging market. In percentage, I mean, it's like 50%, 70%, 80%.
I mean, I think it's hard to give percentages. I think they're well along on the journey is maybe the best way to say it, but we have done it in a very specific transaction with a very specific enabling decree that obviously has to work its way through the legislative process. And that takes time. It takes time even in developed markets where they're used to doing this type of legislation. It takes quite a bit of time. And so there's still some to do. And as I say, we need to create a framework for primary offerings as well, which will facilitate, I think, private capital raising beyond just the privatizations where the state is selling its share in the assets.
That's very important. And after all this work, you still have energy to do new ones, or?
I have plenty of energy to do new ones. So if you've got a deal, you can come speak to me after the panel. But no, I mean, part of the other aspect of this was that the first IPO was not the IPO of a company, right? A real company. It was the IPO of a fund. It's a very interesting product and a very interesting way to approach privatization. So we actually did, Giovanni, we did 13 mini IPOs.
Yes, I know. That's why I'm asking you.
Yeah.
You still want to do another one?
Yeah, plenty of room to do a 14th. No, but it's an innovative way, I think, for the government. It created a real benefit, I think, by bringing companies that might not fully be ready to IPO themselves into a product, into a platform that gets them exposure to the market. It gets investors exposure, a broad-based exposure to the Uzbek market. They're not investing in a single asset. They're investing in 13 assets, which diversifies risk and creates opportunity in a way that would be very difficult to do if you individually IPO'd the 13 assets. But at the end of the day, the goal and Franklin Templeton's mandate is to IPO the underlying assets. So yeah, we're getting ready for 13 deals, hopefully in short order. So
Thank you.
Very exciting opportunity.
Thank you. I think I'm missing Tomor. First of all, very, very simple question for you, which is actually my own curiosity. I mean, you coming from New York, and even though your name suggests a little bit of Eastern flavor as well, Tomor. Why were so many Americans this year? Why? I mean, I've been here for a number of years, and this year I've never seen so many Americans at very high level as well participating to this forum. Have you discovered Uzbekistan only now, or what happened that so many Americans are around?
No, it's not that we just discovered Uzbekistan, but I do think it's a testament of the reforms and the changes and the ambition that the country has and the opportunities that it has for a whole host of investors. I think we're in a very unique moment in time in which there's tremendous capital to be deployed. There are lots of funds that have been raised for energy and infrastructure and similar assets all over the world, and those funds have become only larger and larger. So it's not a question of availability of capital. It's really looking for opportunities. Competition is fierce in a variety of places around the world. The returns are constrained. And so people are really looking for new geographies and new opportunities to deploy money. And one of the challenges in doing that is finding a geography and the opportunity that has a framework around it. I mean legal, I mean regulatory, I mean political support that gives you the confidence that you can deploy money for the long term. As Xavier mentioned, most of these opportunities, most of these investments are not investments that you make for a couple of years and you flip them. These are long-term investments. So with that, there needs to be a level of credibility, opportunity, and confidence in the country, in the opportunity, in the relevant asset, in order to get people's attention. Actually, what the deficit is today is deficit in resources, right? Investors have to pick, where am I going to spend the time, the effort, and the resources to investigate an opportunity, as opposed to, do I have the capital that's available? So I think it's a testament to the country, the politicians here, the ambition, the vision, and really the opportunities that exist for people to deploy real capital.
Thank you, thank you. And you, sorry if I'm insisting on your American origin. For American investor, your investors, yourself, what is really critical? And you have experience investing from US into emerging markets, Latin American, as you told me before. What are the key things you want to see in a contract, as you are a lawyer, that give comfort to American investor investing in places like Uzbekistan, emerging markets, frontier markets, whatever you want to call it? What are the key things you want to see in a contract when representing your clients?
So I think there are a variety of things to make whether it's a privatization process, a sale, a P3 successful. I think it's a variety of things. Contract is one of them, and I'll get to that in a second. But I do think before you even get to the contract, the first thing you really need is public championship and approval, right? What you want to see is effectively a process that you have confidence will reach the end. And in order to do that, you need a public champion, whether it's one ministry, multiple ministries. You need a public champion that's going to drive the process forward. These are very complicated deals with many challenges along the way. You need a public champion to drive the process forward first. Second, you need broad-based approvals for these deals, not just from the politicians, but from the public. It is important as a foreign investor that comes in, that's going to invest in the long term, to do deals that are well accepted by the public, deals that are seen as accretive to the public, not just to the politicians. That is very important. Second, I think the process has to be fair and transparent. For a foreign investor to come in, I think they need to feel that the process is objective, that to the extent that they qualify objectively, they have an equal opportunity to win. Again, it's a question of, if you're going to convince people to come and deploy time, money, and effort, they need to feel that they have a fair shot. And for that, selection criteria needs to be objective, not discretionary, and the rules of the game have to be set up upfront. Let me get to the contract. Very important. I think Xavier used the word I would have used myself, a balanced contract. A good contract means not everybody loses and not everybody wins. A good contract allocates responsibility appropriately, protects both the investor and the grantor or the seller in the same way, and everybody walks away feeling that the risk allocation was appropriate, right? It's not one way. A one-way contract is frankly a recipe for disaster, always. But having said that, I think what's very important is that the contract tries to anticipate properly the types of things that may lead to a dispute and address them up front. Because the key to dispute is never getting to one, or at least having a mechanism that reduces the likelihood that the dispute will ultimately go forward. So you need to make sure that things like a proper dispute resolution forum is in the contract. That's not just whether it's arbitration or litigation. It's not whether the governing law is local or it's foreign. It's really just making sure that the contract appropriately addresses those issues in a way that anticipates the potential dispute. I'd say outside of the contract, and we talked a little bit about this before, is the legal and regulatory framework. If you're going to invest for the next 15, 20, 25, 30 years, the tax regime has to be stable, right? It can't change 5 days, 5 years, or 10 years after you've entered into the contract, because that has a direct adverse impact on your ability to generate a profit. Dispute resolution has to be not just on paper, but effective. You need to be able to make use of it in a meaningful way. I think some of the panelists mentioned foreign currency. If you can't get the revenues out of the country, if you can't convert them into foreign currency, that's a problem. And so you need to make sure that the regime today works, but you also need to make sure that there's no meaningful opportunity to change that in the future. Or if it is going to be changed, that the contract addresses what happens in those circumstances. And then I think the last thing I would say is follow through. One of the most important things that give credibility to any program, and in ambitious programs like you have here, is get deals done. When investors see that you didn't just announce a deal, you actually closed it. That gives tremendous confidence for people to come in and continue to invest. It gives you confidence that these deals actually achieve the results that you want, and it allows you to move forward quickly in essentially meeting your ambitious goals.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tomor. I promised some time for questions, and but I also see that Mr. Murodov, who is the head of Usama, just joined us. I know he has been busy with the president, and so, of course, force majeure for sure. But take the occasion to congratulate, because when you talk about deal dance, he is the man who just a few days ago signed a deal for close to 850 million between investments and capital commitments to be invested in Uzbekistan. It's a huge vote of confidence in the country, in a very interesting and prospective sector. So congratulations once again. And of course, you are the boss here. You can say, if you want to speak and to say something to add, feel free. I mean, it's. But otherwise, I would open the floor to questions that you might have. You have really the opportunity to speak with people which have done these things and ask specific questions, any questions, in case you want. Please go ahead, gentlemen there. And please say your name and to whom you want to ask your question.
My name is Bobur. I'm from Azerbaijan Uzbek Investment Company. I joined not from the beginning. I don't know the names, but it would be to the panel entirely. Let's say you're sitting in a casual dinner in, say, New York or London, and with sort of like investors, and then an investor came with you saying, like, I have, say, 500 million. I'm looking to discover emerging market economies I want to invest in, and you want to pitch, say, Uzbekistan to them. What would be your simple or 2-3 sentence definition of Uzbekistan if you want to, promote or invite them to discover Uzbekistan? for investment destination?
I think we have two Uzbek here, so probably you should ask them. But Alisher, do you want to comment, or maybe Kodir?
Ну, конечно, если
Yes, so of course, if investor possesses such a money, and if investor has such an assets, and Mr. Koderjon mentioned in his speech, each investor, when they think about investing in such a country, they think about the revenues from the investments, right? Previously, we had a problem with currency conversion. They could not get their paybacks, and today, in this case, we could suggest our infrastructure assets that are available on the market at the bidding, or the ones we are to include in this list. And for that investor, I would present all opportunities for privatization, describing all incentives available in the market by the government. First of all, it's the most valuable information for the investor. Secondly, the economy of the country is ever growing, and demand in resources, including logistic resources, is also increasing rapidly, steadily, and assets in energy sector or in ferrous, non-ferrous metals processing, these are very attractive sectors for investor to be, who of course possess such big assets as you mentioned. So we could go in this journey together, and we could of course negotiate and make the best proposal for them.
Yeah, if I would have to make a 5-second elevator pitch to let's say the CEO of Blackstone, and then try to bring them to Uzbekistan, I would say, you know, you are looking at a politically stable country with confident and profitable growth. I like, Tomar, what you said. You know, the credibility builds over time, and the more you get deals done, nothing speaks louder than that. And we have actually a lot of poster child stories that Uzbekistan can be proud of, and the government and the leadership of the country has really followed up on that. You know, what was promised, and President speaks about it every time. He addresses every investor personally, and he says, I personally guarantee safety of your investments. I think you cannot get a better confirmation as a foreign investor when the leader from the very top tells that and actually follows up with the real results.
Very good. I think we are getting close because, you know, I'm Italian, but Northern Italian, almost Swiss, and now we are supposed to finish, but maybe we are also flexible. So if there is another question, maybe another couple of questions maximum, then we have to close. The ladies over there.
Tea Johadze Capital. I'm stress testing a private equity thesis for Uzbekistan and Middle Corridor, and I wanted to ask Kodirjon and also others, what would be a word of caution that you would need to think through before you commit to this market?
Thank you for bringing up this question. Of course, as we were fundraising, you know, the concept of private equity fund that we just finished, for those who just joined, Highland Capital just did the first close with 36 million with high quality investors, IFC, EBRD, and the Silk Road Fund of China. We're speaking now with EIB, DEG, CFM, and ADB, who we hope will join us for the final close, and total fund size is expected to be 75 million. So it was a long journey. I started in 2012. And this run, the latest run, started in 2021. So we had to do a lot of convincing, and we were asked this question that you brought up. So one of the biggest risks in this market is the liquidity risk. Because as an LP, as a limited partner, when you give the money to a private equity fund, and for those who don't know, private equity funds are created for a specific term. So our fund is created for 7 years, and we have 2 one-year extension periods. So let's say in 7 years, we have to give money in full to the investors. So we're talking about return of equity. And then also, we also have to generate return on equity. But the first one, the return of equity, when you're talking about emerging markets, frontier markets, is actually more important than the income, because in frontier markets, investors are happy with 6 to 7% annualized return, let's say IRR in US dollars. But if you can generate 15 or 20%, and the Fund 1 of Highland Capital actually generated 24% IRR in US dollars, gross IRR, and because the fund size was small, it was 12% IRR. So liquidity is probably the main the factor. Usually, in a lot of markets like this, a second factor is the stability of the currency. But what we can be proud here, sitting on this panel, we can say that Uzbekistan currency not only was stable, but it's actually appreciated against the dollar. Thanks to the American administration, some others, there's a lot of volatility in the markets, and the gold price is high and will probably remain high. And as long as we have higher gold prices, and this is the main export of Uzbekistan, we can be confident that the stability of the currency convertibility will remain for many years forward. So luckily, this factor is not present here.
I think we reach an end of our very, I believe, quite interesting panel. We heard from Alisher that there are many other assets which are coming up, and very clear ideas from the government on what to do. So I'm not want to say we are just at the beginning, but more or less, yes. Markets, as Eugene was mentioning, they have appetite for Uzbekistan, and there is capacity. The legal infrastructure is there or is almost there, and a lot of work has been done preparing the road for new IPOs. International investment and regulation is very important for very serious investors like Aéroports de Paris, and the presence of new players which are more typical for Western markets give confidence in the development of capital markets. I'm referring to private equity. And more importantly, I believe that credibility is being developed by doing deals. And we clearly see that in very short period of time, Uzbekistan has delivered 2 very significant deals. And I think that's the best testament to the commitment of the Uzbek government and the reciprocal interest of international investors. So I believe that we are just looking at something very prospective, a very nice story, which we hope we will continue. And in a few years, we will talk about Uzbekistan being part of the index, as Eugene was mentioning, in a very significant way. So thank you very much for listening to us, and maybe a round of applause for this fantastic panel. And thank you for being here.
Kimge topşırıp getireyim? Yok, bilmiyorum. Ha, Kyorin.